What I'm going to do is I'm going to just talk briefly for about 15 minutes about why I decided to do the podcast, what tools I used, my favorite aspects of the craft, pitfalls to avoid, and then ways to make a podcast more engaging. Give you a little bit of background about me. I'm a 25-year naval officer, started off enlisted, and I've had 3 careers. So I started fixing airplanes. Then I was a surface warfare officer after I got my commission. Then for the last 10 to 15 years, roughly, I've been a public affairs officer for the Navy. And I got into podcasting, believe it or not necessarily because of my job, but because I was helping with a nonprofit for military women. It's called the Sea Services Leadership Association. And we had to go virtual in 2020, and I became the co-chair for the virtual series. So we started off by doing webinars, and that delved into doing those webinars live, and we had to line up the guests, and we had to have the conversations. And it got me very comfortable with interviewing. I had done stories before and I've been a blogger for years, but after that point, I realized that I was onto something and we were onto something with having these really deep and engaging conversations. And that got me on the path of running a mentoring group for the Navy communicators in the Eastern region. We've done about 10 episodes so far. It is a mentoring program run by the Navy Chief of Information. And every month we have on different guests. And then from there, I started wanting to just do my own podcasts and really talk to people who inspire me. So I have a podcast now called Stories of Service, Ordinary People Who Do Extraordinary Work. And I feature people from all walks of life who use service as a way of giving back. And that comes from my own journey of giving back to others and being a part of nonprofits as a way to move past my own trauma. And so that was how I got into podcasting. And I'm confident that any company with 0 to no budget can have an internal podcast. So I'm definitely speaking from the novice perspective. I don't have a big decked out studio. This is it, this office that you see here. All the lighting and the mic and everything else, I've just kind of gradually, leveled up slightly, but I'm still what I would consider a very novice podcaster. So the perspective that I give you is not from, I'm an expert, I've got these great studio and I have this wonderful process, but it's how did I get any of these things launched off the ground? And so that's kind of where I want to start. Why I decided to do all this was because I think there's nothing better than having a deep and meaningful conversation with somebody else about why you have a policy in place, why there's an issue at your workforce. We need places and spaces where people can speak with authenticity. And I believe that podcasting is one of the most wonderful ways to do that, because you can do it through your video. You can just listen to it audio. It's just an amazing thing. I mean, I'm going back through some of my old podcasts now and cutting some clips, and it just reminds me how much I love what I do. So the tools that I used, and this is, like I say, something I think anybody can do. You can start off just something very simple. Get a YouTube channel going, because then you have a repository to where you can post the videos. They can be unlisted. They don't have to go out to the public. They can be something within internal to your organization. That was one of the first things that I did when I started the mentoring group, is I made sure that I had a place that I could store all these podcasts. I also did a lot of listening within my Navy public affairs community about what issues were permeating and resonating with my subjects. So we have controversial issues within the public affairs community that nobody really understands or has a lot of guidance on. So I had to seek subject matter experts who understood those issues so that we could further that conversation. So I think those are kind of the first steps: is, do I have a speaker lineup? Do I have a place to store the podcast? And then do I have a medium like Zoom or StreamYard or something to just film these things and archive them? And then once you have those things, I feel, and you have your chain, well, not chain of command, you have your company's buy-in, then I think you're off and running. It doesn't have to be this major thing. A lot of it is just understanding how to line up those guests and how to create a battle rhythm of people who will come on and have these amazing conversations. I started my Navy mentoring podcast about a year and a half ago. And things that we talked about were promotions. How do you promote? What does the board want to see? And we did that right around the time that the Navy was doing their promotion cycle, so that people would be prepared for what they needed to have. So I think that that's the first and foremost, is know what issues are resonating among your workforce, and then making sure that you can line up guests that can talk to those issues. A lot of times depending on the guest is how much information I would give up front. Usually I just wanted to kind of, like the other guest just said, Jordan, I like just giving topic areas. I don't want to get into the details of every single question I'm going to ask, because I get inspired when I'm listening to somebody. I'm like, oh my gosh, I should ask this, I should ask that. And we start going deeper and deeper into whatever it is we're talking about. That's what I absolutely love about podcasting, is that a lot of times I would get frustrated when I'd watch a news clip, or I'd see an interview and I'd say, why didn't they ask that? Why didn't they go there? And so podcasting gives you guys the opportunity, as the communicators, as the eyes and ears of the organization, to go deep down into those issues that are permeating among your employees. And a lot of times I feel like you can get in front of an issue that's percolating within your company, just by putting out a podcast or some sort of a conversation with somebody who's a subject matter expert in that area that can talk to that issue. So you've got your YouTube unlisted link, you've got your Zoom or some other inexpensive way to record these things. And these are just very basic subscription services. Zoom, I paid for the pro membership. It was like $120 a year. YouTube is free. You could store them for free on YouTube. So I'm also giving you guys the overview too of how to do this on a budget, because if you're starting out, your company might not give you any money or any resources really to do this. And then when you start to design your promos, go ahead and use Canva. Get on a free Canva account, make them all the same, come up with some brand colors and some ways to make your messaging appealing, and put that stuff out. We had Facebook groups for the Navy communicators. We had probably about 6 or 7 of them. So routinely, I would always put out, in addition to an email distro that I had of everybody who's in the Navy Eastern region, I would put out these flyers. And in the flyers, I'd have the person's picture, I'd have some graphics, and then I would describe what we were going to be talking about. I would title the session very similar to what's been done here with this conference. And from that point, people would just dial in and they would participate, ask questions. And after that, it would be recorded. I'd upload the recording, and then I would post the recording back on the email distro. And then I would also post it to all the Facebook groups within the comments, which of course would make it rise to the top. I mean, that's it. That was as simple as I could get it, to where I knew that it was sustainable. And I'll tell you, the example that this set was amazing. I got asked by the Navy Alumni Association to share some of the best practices and tips for how we did it. It led to blog postings. That's another thing you can do with your podcast, is if an employee talks about an issue that's really meaningful and resonates with people, you can repurpose that podcast for a newsletter article or something else that can go out. So I think that that's probably the simplest way that I found to do this, and to not get too stressed out about the details. Because I think sometimes we see this big production value and we see how huge and wonderful this can look if you're Joe Rogan, and you think, oh my gosh, why can't I have that? And then it kind of cripples you and you don't want to do it because it's not going to be perfect. And I'm here to say that that's okay. I think that if you've got the trust in your CEO or your boss, and you have a good guest lineup, that was another thing I did too, is even before I started, I consulted with the leadership within the public affairs community, and I gave them some topics and guests, and I kind of bounced ideas off people, because I really no one had ever done something like this before. And so I had to kind of get their buy-in and be prepared for any pitfalls that I could avoid by doing this. And so with that, I'll also give, some of the pitfalls to avoid. So some of the things that I learned early on is, making sure the guest comes a little early to the podcast, because you never know, in those 10, 15 minutes, you can work out a lot of technical issues. So technical issues happen. Sometimes you're not going to have a perfect podcast. I've learned to have backup cameras. Sometimes my camera would go out. Yeah, so I'm kind of going to go through the chat. I don't know if the other guests are going through the chat as they're doing this, but yeah, expectations, absolutely. Because I think, again, people think you have to be perfect to do this stuff, and you don't. I can tell you that right now. I'm not perfect, and I'm okay with that. I'm very happy with what we've been able to put together. I now have a co-host for the Navy mentoring group, and so when I've been down for shoulder surgery and not been able to do things or been away at school, she's able to take over and do some of these interviews as well. And I'm really proud, like, to see that it's continuing to go on even when I'm not able to do some of the interviews. I think another thing, other than, getting rid of that imposter syndrome, another pitfall to avoid is to not just think that this has to be the only way that you put out the message. If you have a podcast, use it. Use small clips. There's 2 minutes or a 1 minute soundbite video that you can repurpose and put out in other mediums, and do that, because, like I said, it's such an amazing opportunity to put your message in different forums. You can put it in a blast email, some of the quotes from, like, some of the most impactful parts of the conversation. And I think that the last part of this, and then I'll close and I'll just kind of open it up for questions, because, again, this was just sort of an overview of what I've been able to do with the podcast, with a Zoom link, a YouTube channel, and Canva. I mean, so that's what, 3? If you're just going internal, I don't feel like you need anything more than those 3 resources. And I'm not, endorsing them particularly. I'm just saying those were the easiest for me to get started with mine. And at that point, I thought, okay, I'm off to the races just having this. And that's really what gave me the confidence to even launch my own podcast. If I hadn't done the webinars with the nonprofit and then did the Navy mentoring group podcast, it would have never given me the confidence to branch out and do my own podcast. So that is another thing I would encourage you guys to do, is as you build this internal comms podcast, think to yourself, my God, I'm getting this an amazing career opportunity to build my skills as a communicator and my interviewing skills. I mean, today, last few days, I've been shoulder down, but I'm going through all my old clips and I'm finding little pieces that I can cut. And it's a great opportunity to self-assess as you watch the interviews back and say, oh, should I have asked the question a little bit differently this way? Or did I cut off the guests when they were still talking? I've done that. See, pitfalls to avoid. I say too much, or my ums or my ahs. So there's so many opportunities to fine-tune your communications game through podcasting. And so I highly encourage it. I'm so passionate about podcasting in general and long-form conversations, because there's so much that you can get from having these kinds of conversations and engaging with your employees on so much more of a deep and meaningful level. And like what Jordan said, people listening to their employee podcast on Thanksgiving, people listening to it at home. I guarantee you that's going to happen. When I put out a podcast about disinformation, oh my gosh, it's a very controversial issue within the Navy, and I think in corporate America as well right now. Even though I don't think disinformation is anything new, the way that it's being used right now is relatively novel with social media. And so it was just it resonated with so many people. I was able to take some of those internal podcasts that I thought had a wider audience appeal beyond the Navy public affairs community, put those on my LinkedIn, and then repurpose those for larger communication audience. So that's another thing that you can do with them. So with that, I said I would open it up for questions for the last 5-10 minutes. And if there's no questions, that's okay too. I just hope that this presentation gives you guys the strength and confidence to know that you can launch this thing. Create a 1-page proposal to your boss and say, I want to do this. This is why. These are the issues that I keep hearing about. And if I can talk to people one-on-one and have these conversations, I really think this will eliminate a lot of the issues that we're having. And with that, I am done.
Well, awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. And honestly, I can tell, I can see, like you've mentioned how you started from the ground up, you're self-taught, just your passion. I can just see the way you present yourself, the way you talk about the topic of podcasting. I can see your love for it. And that is so awesome to see. Just as a reminder, if anyone does have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. I actually do have one. I love how you mentioned again, starting out with the podcast, it doesn't have to be perfect. Most likely, especially starting out, it won't be. And that's totally fine. That being said, this is more out of my curiosity. Thinking of where you were when you first started your podcast journey and where you are now, what's maybe one thing you wish someone had told you, or one thing you wish you did know when starting out to do your podcast?
That's a really good question. I think I wish that somebody had just told me to get those 30 services right away. It took me a long time to just pay the money for the full Canva account and then pay for the Zoom Pro. We didn't, the Navy mentoring group is all volunteer run. So there was no blueprint for how we could get this. And so I wish going into it, I had understood how easy some of those tools were and used and maybe started it even sooner. But because I just didn't even know where to start or how to get the guests. And I can remember like my heart would just beat and I'd be so nervous interviewing certain guests. And I don't really get that as much anymore because I'm more comfortable with what I'm doing. I think one of the mistakes I made in the beginning was I didn't have my notes here of kind of the topics that I wanted to go into. I'm very good at asking questions off the cuff, but you can't rely on that because sometimes I'd watch an episode, a replay, and I'd say, oh man, I should have asked him or her about this. I should have gone deeper into that. So I would say you don't necessarily need to have all your questions written out, but definitely have your topic areas because you don't want to miss anything. And the other thing is, for me, an hour is my sweet spot. So I try not to go over an hour and I try not to go under, but if 36 minutes is all that we got to talk about, I can sense when we're kind of at a lull in the conversation and I'm not going to just keep it going just for the sake of keeping it going. So I think that was also what helped me was understanding your conversation sweet spot. I'm a person that likes to go out to lunch for about an hour. I kind of run out of things to talk about after that. It depends on the person, obviously. And some people are just in and out. Like I had Carol Baskin on, Big Cat Rescue, Tiger King, Carol Baskin, and she was all business. So I got her in and out in 36 minutes. Whereas I had a talk just the other day with Barbie the welder, and oh my God, we just got into some of these really deep issues, and we went over an hour. So know your guest and understand what it is they need to get out of the conversation. Like with Carol, I think she just wanted to get out some of the advocacy on big cats and some of the, don't go to pay for play, tiger exotic animal exhibits, how Tiger King really did a disservice to the animal protection community, even though it did give her exposure. So there were certain things that we needed to cover in that conversation. But then with Barbie the welder, she put so much of her personality and herself into her work. And so she's a lot more willing, I think, to go deep. And so if you can sense that about your guests, who's willing to go a little further in the conversation, try to pull those things out, because I think it just makes for a more meaningful conversation.
Mm-hmm. A great insight for sure. We did get a question. Some people in the chat have actually kind of answered it, which is awesome to see. But we had someone ask, how do you use Canva for your podcast?
Okay, so I use Canva for my promos. So when I say promo, it is a graphic that I attach to a Facebook post or an Instagram post or a LinkedIn post that advertises the event. So you have to come up with your blurb, your teaser, or your show notes. I have a lot of, I guess this is another thing, getting back to your question of what would you do now differently. I repurpose a lot because I'm a one-woman show. So my show notes are the same thing that you see in my YouTube description. They're the same thing that you see that is my teaser that leads people into the podcast. I don't change any of that very much. So that blurb is what I attach to the graphic. And then what I do is I put the graphic out 24 to 48 hours. Now I'm talking my Stories of Service podcast, not internal. Internal for mentoring, I just put on the Facebook groups. But for my own personal podcast, I do 24 to 48 hours along with the StreamYard link. I put a graphic and I put my, what I call, your show notes or your episode description. And then what I do when I upload to the audio servers, because I now have a Buzzsprout account and I upload to audio as well. And I do this live. So my podcast goes live and then onto YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And then I upload later to all the audio people. But again, I repurpose because I'm a one-woman show. So every time I do it, I just attach the graphic to the show notes, and then 24 to 48 hours prior, and then 24 hours prior, because Instagram story and Instagram Facebook is 24 hours. I take that exact same graphic and I put it on story. So it's not only getting purposed in somebody's news feed, it's also going on their stories on Instagram and Facebook.
Mm-hmm. Well, awesome. I think that puts us pretty close to our time. Just before we go, since other speakers had like that final PowerPoint slide of where you could find their podcast or where to get in contact with them. Is there anything you'd like to share with our guests if they want to get in contact with you or listen to your podcast?
Absolutely. My podcast is called Stories of Service. So SOS is the acronym for it. And it's all based on the idea that we all need help at any given time. And it's you can find it on all the podcast servers. I can be found on LinkedIn. And then I also have a blog called Teresa's Tapestries. That's how I got started. In 2014, I started a blog. And that's how I kind of started putting out somewhat of a personal brand, I would say. And then it's now just expanded into the podcast and then as well as being pretty active on social media.
All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Teresa.
Well, thank you so much, Gina. I appreciate the opportunity to share.